So you want to own a knight's manor, 600 acres of England, a stone hall with your arms cut over the doorway, a village that owes you labor by law, a watermill that everyone for 3 miles is legally required to use, and a warhorse in the stable worth more than the mill pond, and the miller put together. Before you sign anything, look at a hole in the records that ought to be much more famous than it is. By the middle of the 13th century, the English crown reckoned itself owed the service of somewhere in the region of 5,000 knights. 5,000 knights' fees, listed, inherited, surveyed, taxed, fought over in court. On paper, 5,000 estates whose entire legal purpose was to produce one armored man on one trained horse. Now count the knights. Historians who have tried to put a number on it come out somewhere between about 1,000 and 2,000 actual belted knights in the whole of England around the year 1300. Estimates vary, and the counting is genuinely hard, but every attempt lands in the same embarrassing place. The country was full of estates built to make knights. Most of them had stopped making knights. And here is the part that should stop you dead. The crown got so frustrated about this that it started fining men to force them to become knights. If your land was worth £20 a year, the sheriff could order you to come and take up knighthood. And if you refused, you paid. Read that again. The King of England had to threaten his own landowners with financial penalties to make them accept a promotion into the warrior aristocracy. Thousands of men looked at the honor, looked at the estate that came with it, did the arithmetic, and quietly chose the fine. That is your first real piece of information about this business, and it is worth more than any castle drawing. Because a knight's manor was never an asset that produced an income. It was an income that produced obligations. And for 200 years, the men who owned them spent an extraordinary amount of energy trying not to be identified as the men who owned them. So let's buy one anyway. We'll walk the fields, we'll open the account roll, we'll pay the wages, hold the court, take the fines, sell the wool, and then we'll send you off to war for 40 days and count what's left when you get back. By the end of this, you'll have a working profit and loss for a real, documented English manor. You'll know which single line on that sheet was quietly eating the whole thing. And you'll know why the men who got genuinely rich off manors like yours were, almost without exception, the men who never once put on the armor. One housekeeping note before we start, because the numbers are useless without it. English money runs in pounds, shillings, and pence. 20 shillings to the pound, 12 pence to the shilling, 240 pence in a pound. You'll also hear the mark, which is 13 shillings and 4 pence, 2/3 of a pound, and which existed mainly to make accountants feel needed. Start with the deed, because there isn't one. This is the first thing to unlearn. You do not own this manor. Nobody in England owns land except the king, and even that is arguable depending on which clergyman you ask. What you own is a tenure, a way of holding. You hold this manor of somebody, and that somebody holds of somebody else, and the chain runs upward until it reaches the crown. Your rung on that ladder is called a knight's fee, and the price of standing on it is service. The paperwork for this system survives, and it is wonderfully petty. In 1166, Henry II sent out a questionnaire to every tenant-in-chief in England. How many knights do you owe me? How many did you owe in my grandfather's day? Who are they and what do they hold? The returns are known as the Carte Baronum, the Baron's letters, and they are essentially the crown auditing its own military supply chain because it suspected correctly that it was being shortchanged. Now, how big is a knight's fee? The textbook answer is 5 hides, and a hide is notionally 120 acres, which gives you 600 acres. Keep that number, but hold it loosely. In the actual records, fees are chaotic. Some estates owe the service of a whole knight. Some owe a half, a third, a quarter. There are fees owing 1/40th of a knight, which raises the delightful administrative question of what 1/40th of an armored man is supposed to do on a battlefield. The answer, as we'll see, is pay. The more useful measure is money. £20 a year of landed income was the working threshold for knighthood in 13th century England. That is the number the sheriff used. That is the number that got you the summons. So picture your purchase as a machine rated at £20 a year of net landed income, with a legal duty bolted to it. And here is where the fantasy starts to leak. Along with the land, you have inherited a set of liabilities called incidents, and they are the reason feudal lordship was profitable for the man above you and expensive for you. When you inherit, you pay a relief, a fee to be allowed to take up your own father's land. Magna Carta in 1215 actually capped this, which tells you it had been abused. £100 for a whole barony, 100 shillings, £5 for a whole knight's fee. If you die and your heir is a child, the lord takes wardship. He holds the estate, takes the income, and has no obligation to reinvest a penny of it. Wardships were bought and sold as investments. A minority of 12 years on a decent manor was somebody else's 12 years of free income. He also controls the marriage of your heir. That right had a market price too. And if you die with no heir at all, the whole thing reverts upward. That's escheat. So the asset you are buying comes with a built-in tax on death, a built-in tax on childhood, and a built-in tax on love. Hold that thought about wardship. It comes back at the end, and it is not a small point. Let's total up what it costs to actually take possession and be operational. Relief on a full night's fee, £5. Fine. That's a quarter of your annual income, and it's survivable. Then there's the equipment, and this is where the model starts groaning. The single most expensive thing a knight owned was not his armor. It was his horse, and not one horse. A working knight on campaign needed several. Something to fight on, something to travel on, something to carry the baggage. The fighting horse, the destrier, or the courser was a specialist animal, bred for it, trained for years, expensive to feed because it lived on oats rather than grass, and physically fragile in exactly the situation you bought it for. We have unusually good data on this because of a piece of English military bureaucracy called Restaro Equorum, the restoration of horses. Before a campaign, royal clerks appraised and recorded every warhorse brought by every man in the army, with its value and often its color and markings, so that the crown could compensate the owner if it was killed in service. It was, in effect, state-administered horse insurance, and it generated lists. Those lists show enormous spread. At the bottom end, ordinary mounts for mounted archers and servants valued in low single figures of pounds. In the middle, a working knight's warhorse commonly appraised somewhere in the region of 10 to 20 pounds. At the top, the animals ridden by earls and bannerets appraised at 40, 60, 100 pounds and more. Sit with that against your 20 pounds a year. One horse, one animal that eats grain daily, needs a groom, can go lame on a road, can die of a stomach twist in a field in peacetime, and is statistically likely to be killed underneath you in the one activity it was purchased for. And it can cost you a full year of everything your 600 acres produce, then the harness, mail, and by the 14th century, increasingly plate, which is not cheap and is not one purchase, but a lifetime of replacement, adjustment, and repair. Helm, shield, sword, lance, spare weapons, because lances break by design. Then, if you actually go through with it, the knighting itself. Becoming a knight was a ceremony with a social floor. Feasting, robes, gifts, hospitality. Men complained about this cost, specifically and in writing. Put it together, and the picture is stark. The estate is rated at 20 pounds a year. The kit to perform the service the estate exists to provide can eat several years of that. This is the single cleanest explanation for the missing knights in our cold open. It was not cowardice. It was a spreadsheet. If you like history with the receipts attached, subscribe. One business every week, opened up and costed out. And stay with me for the section on the summer of 1349, because there is a line in this account book that goes from ordinary to catastrophic in about 18 months. Now let's actually go and look at the thing you've bought. Our model is Cuxham, a village in Oxfordshire. I'm choosing it for one reason. The paperwork is astonishing. Merton College, Oxford, acquired it in 1268. And because colleges keep archives with a diligence that families simply do not, we have an almost unbroken run of annual manorial accounts from the 1270s through into the 1350s, along with court records and correspondence. It was studied in depth by the historian P.D.A. Harvey, and it is one of the best documented villages in medieval Europe. Cuxham is small, around 200 acres of domain arable, roughly a dozen villein households holding about 12 acres each, plus a handful of cottagers with barely more than a garden. A church, a mill, a manor house that is a working farmyard with a hall attached rather than anything you'd call a castle. That's the scale we're talking about, not Camelot. A large farm with legal powers. Walk it and you'll find the land divided into two categories that behave completely differently. The first is the demesne. This is the land you farm for yourself with your own seed, your own plows, your own oxen, and labor that is largely not paid for in cash. Its output is yours to eat, sell, or store. The second is the tenant land, and this is not really land from your point of view. It is a portfolio of contracts. Each holding carries a bundle of things owed to you: money, rent, labor, fines on specific life events, compulsory use of your facilities. Crucially, the fields are not enclosed squares with hedges. Your domain is scattered in strips through the same open fields as everybody else's, mixed in among your tenants' strips. There is a rotation, commonly winter grain, then spring grain, then fallow. Everyone's animals graze the fallow together. Everyone plows at roughly the same time because they have to, which means you cannot innovate alone. You cannot decide to try something clever in the North Field because the North Field is not yours. It's a communal system you happen to be the largest shareholder in. Agricultural change here moves at the speed of village consensus, which is to say, it does not move. Now, the buildings that actually matter, and they are not the hall, the mill. Your tenants are legally bound to grind their grain at your mill and nowhere else. That's called suit of mill. The miller takes a cut of the grain itself as payment, and the fraction varies by custom, often somewhere between roughly a 13th and a 24th. Court rolls across England are full of prosecutions for hand mills, small querns hidden in cottages so people could grind their own. Lords confiscated them. In some places, they smashed them and used the stones for paving, which is a very direct way of telling a village how monopoly works. The dovecote, which only a lord may keep, and which feeds on your tenant's grain. The oven and the brewhouse, where custom allows. And the court, which is not a building, but is the most profitable institution on the estate. We'll come to it. Here is the strangest line in your accounts, and it is the one that separates this from any business you have ever seen. You do not primarily buy labor. You own it. An unfree tenant, a villein, holds his 12 acres from you on terms that include working your land. Week work is the regular obligation, commonly 2 or 3 days a week through much of the year. Boon work is the surge capacity, extra days demanded at harvest when every hour counts, often sweetened with food and ale because even lords understood incentive. So at exactly the moment your crop must come in, you have a legal claim on the village's arms. Then there are the famuli. These are your permanent, full-time farm staff. Plowmen, carters, a shepherd, a dairy maid. They are paid partly in a small cash stipend, a few shillings a year, and mostly in livery, a fixed allowance of grain issued regularly. Their real wage is food, and it is priced in the one commodity you produce in bulk. And running the whole operation day to day is the reeve. The reeve is the most interesting job in medieval England, and almost nobody has heard of it. He is not a gentleman. He is usually a villein, chosen from among the tenants, often under protest, and he is responsible for the entire agricultural year and for producing the annual account. He knows every acre. He knows who is lying about their oxen. At Cuxham, we even know one by name. Robert Oldman ran that manor as reeve for decades in the first half of the 14th century. Decades. Through good harvests and bad, through the famine years, keeping the accounts that historians are still reading 700 years later. He died in 1349. We'll come back to that, and to why it mattered more than any harvest. Above the reeve sits the bailiff, a paid professional, and above him, if you own several manors, a steward who is educated, legally trained, and increasingly, the person who actually understands your estate better than you do. This is worth stating plainly. In the ordinary running of a knight's manor, there is no obvious task that requires a knight. The system was designed so that the lord could be somewhere else. That is the whole point. The manor is a machine for converting village labor into a landowner's ability to be absent, and the advice literature knew it. Around the 1240s, Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, wrote a set of estate management rules for the widowed Countess of Lincoln. Around the 1280s, a treatise called Husbandry, attributed to Walter of Henley, laid out the arithmetic of plowing, sowing, and stocking in plain terms. This is a genre, management consultancy in the 13th century for absentee owners. Walter's most famous piece of advice is a cost comparison. Should you plow with horses or oxen? Horses are faster, but the horse eats oats, which is expensive, and when the horse is finished, you have a dead horse. The ox eats grass, and when the ox is finished, you have beef and a hide. Oxen, he concludes, are cheaper. That is the intellectual world of your manor, not chivalry, depreciation. Right, money in. There are 5 taps, and they are wildly different in character. 1. Grain from the demesne, and immediately bad news. Medieval yields were low, not slightly low, structurally, painfully low. After you set aside next year's seed, a demesne harvest commonly returns something in the region of 3 or 4 times the grain sown, and wheat was often the worst offender. Walter of Henley grumbles about this directly, essentially arguing that if your wheat isn't returning better than that, you should question why you're growing it. Translate that into the number that actually hurts. Something like a fifth to a quarter of everything you harvest goes straight back into the ground next autumn as seed. Before anyone eats, before anything is sold, your largest single input cost is your own output, and you pay it first. 2. Wool. This is where the real money was, and it is the great correction to the whole picture. English wool was the finest bulk commodity in Northern Europe, and the Flemish and Italian cloth industries were desperate for it. Sheep need less labor than arable. They graze land that grows nothing else, and their product does not rot on the road to market. The Italians kept lists. A Florentine merchant's handbook of around 1340 ranks English monastic wool houses by quality and price like a wine guide. That is what the export market thought of your hillsides. If your manor has good pasture, wool may quietly outperform every field you own. 3. Assize rents. The fixed money rents from tenant holdings, reliable, predictable, low maintenance, and over a long enough period, quietly disastrous, because they were fixed by custom, and custom does not index for inflation. In the 13th century, with prices rising, a fixed rent set generations ago is an asset melting in your hand. 4. The court. This is the tap nobody expects, and on many manors, it is startlingly good. Your manorial court meets regularly, settles disputes, enforces custom, and levies charges. And the charges are attached to being alive. A tenant dies. You take a Harriet, customarily his best beast. On a small holding, that may be the only plow ox the family had, taken at the exact moment they've lost the man who worked it. A tenant's daughter marries. Merchant, a payment for permission. A tenant's daughter has a child outside marriage. Lair white, a fine. A tenant wants to take on a holding, an entry fine, and this is the one that moved. In the crowded generations before 1348, when England was full of people and land was scarce, entry fines rose hard because the queue for a vacant holding was long. Add ale fines, straying animals, unrepaired ditches, bad brewing, trespass, and the court becomes a steady, low-cost, high-margin business with no raw materials. 5. Everything else. Pannage for pigs in your woods, the mill's cut, timber, fish ponds, occasional tallage. Now here's the thing to notice about that list. Only 2 of those 5 taps are agriculture. The other 3 are essentially rent, monopoly, and jurisdiction. You did not buy a farm. You bought a small tax jurisdiction with a farm attached. Money out. Seed. As established, straight off the top. Famuli stipends and grain liveries, plows, harrows, carts, harness, all of which break constantly. Roofing and repairs on hall, barn, byre, and mill. Cartage to market. The bailiffs and stewards' fees. Hospitality, which is not optional, because a lord who does not feed people is a lord nobody obeys. Then the church, taking its share. Then the crown, taking taxes on movable goods. And then finally, the line item this entire estate exists to fund: your service. The classic formulation is 40 days a year of unpaid military service owed to your lord, who owes it upward to the king. In practice, this was negotiated, disputed, and endlessly awkward, because 40 days is a useless length of time for a real campaign. A serious war in Wales or Scotland or France does not conclude on schedule, so the crown and the landowners found a solution that suited both, and it is the most important financial instrument in this entire video. Scutage, shield money. You pay cash instead of turning up. For the king, this is transformative. Cash buys professional soldiers who serve as long as they're paid and do what they're told. For you, it is liberation. You settle a bill and stay home with your account rolls. Scutage was levied at rates that fluctuated commonly around £1 or 2 marks per fee, sometimes more, and King John collected it so relentlessly and so often that resistance to it is baked directly into Magna Carta, which demands that scutage not be levied without common counsel of the realm. Think about what that means. One of the most famous documents in the history of liberty contains, in plain sight, a clause about the terms on which the landowning class is allowed to buy its way out of fighting. And the effect on your manor is total. The military obligation, the thing that defines your tenure, the reason the estate is a knight's fee at all, has been converted into a recurring cash charge. Now, could war make money? Yes. Ransoms were real, plunder was real, wages for paid service were real, and a lucky campaign could rebuild a family. But it was a lottery ticket with a large entry fee and a genuine risk of death, mutilation, or being on the wrong side of a ransom demand yourself. For the median manor holder, war was a cost center. Now the risks, and they arrive in a specific order. Weather. In 1315, the rain did not stop. 2 catastrophic harvests in a row, grain prices to levels people had never seen, famine across northern Europe. Your fixed rents don't rise with grain prices, but your tenant's ability to pay collapses. Animal disease. Sheep murrain repeatedly savaged flocks in the late 13th century. Then between 1319 and 1321, a cattle plague swept England and killed a devastating share of the national herd. Lose your oxen and you have not lost livestock. You have lost the engine, you cannot plow, and the replacement cost arrives in the year you can least afford it. Minority. You die young, your heir is 7, and your lord takes the estate in wardship for 11 years and farms it for cash without a thought for its long-term condition. Forfeiture. Back the wrong claimant and the crown takes everything. And then, in the summer of 1348, plague arrives in England. Within about 2 years, something in the region of 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of the country is dead. At Cuxham, where we have the records, the manor loses its tenants in appalling numbers. Robert Oldman, the reeve who had run that place for decades, dies in 1349. The village goes through reeve after reeve in quick succession because the men who knew the job keep dying. Now watch what that does to your business model, because it is not what people expect. Your manor's profitability rested on one condition: too many people, not enough land. That is what made entry fines high, made labor services enforceable, and made a tenant grateful for 12 acres on hard terms. Overnight, that reverses. Suddenly there is more land than there are people to work it. Holdings stand empty. Tenants can walk to the next village and be offered better terms by a desperate lord who won't ask questions. Wages for free. Labor rise sharply, entry fines slump. The government's response is instructive in its panic. In 1349, and then as a full statute in 1351, the Crown attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel people to work for whoever asks. It is one of the earliest large-scale attempts at national wage control in English history. And it does not work because you cannot legislate away a labor shortage. And so, across the following decades, English lords do the arithmetic and quietly surrender. They stop farming the demesne themselves. They lease it out, in whole or in parcels, for a fixed money rent and let somebody else absorb the risk of harvests, wages, weather, and murrain. That decision ends the manorial system as an operating business. The lord stops being a farmer and becomes a landlord. And by 1381, when tens of thousands of people march on London in the Great Revolt, part of what they are demanding is the formal end of the unfree status that this whole model was built on. So, could you get rich owning a knight's manor? Straight answer. As a single manor held by a man who actually performed the service it was created for, almost never. It was a competence, not a fortune. It bought you standing, a decent table, and the right to be addressed properly. Then the horse, the harness, the hospitality, and the crown took most of the surplus back. 3 kinds of people got rich, and it is worth saying exactly who. First, the ones who refused the job. The men who paid the fine rather than take up knighthood, paid the scutage rather than ride out. kept the £20 a year and kept themselves alive to spend it. They took the machine and detached it from the obligation, and their descendants became the English gentry. Not a warrior class, a rentier class with a coat of arms. Second, the men who ran manors without owning them. The stewards, the lawyers, the estate administrators, educated men with legal training who could manage 20 manors for absentee lords and understood the customs better than the families who inherited them. That skill compounded. Repeatedly in English history, you find the professional who managed the land ending up owning land while the family that hired him quietly runs out of heirs. Third, and above both of them, the institutions, abbeys, cathedrals, colleges. And the reason is brutally simple and has nothing to do with piety. An institution never dies, so it never pays a relief. Its heir is never a minor, so it never suffers a wardship. It never has to marry off a daughter, never leaves an estate to be split between 3 sons, never backs a losing king, and never falls in battle. Every single one of those incidents we listed at the start, the taxes on death and childhood and love, simply does not apply. That is why Merton College still had the records of Cuxham to hand to historians centuries later, while the knightly families who held the manors on either side of it left almost nothing but a name in a tax return. So here is the honest verdict. You were never buying a farm, and you were never really buying land. You were buying a position in a structure that converted a village's labor into one man's ability to be somewhere else, wearing something expensive on a horse that cost a year's income and would probably be killed. And within about a century of the point where that structure was most tightly enforced, the men who held it had collectively decided that the most rational thing to do with a knight's manor was to stop being a knight, stop farming it, and simply collect the rent. The estates outlasted the obligation. The obligation was the entire point, and the fine you were going to pay to avoid it turned out to be the smartest £20 anybody in England ever spent.